Morning arrives quietly on Nob Hill. Fog from the Pacific slips between the buildings and drifts along California Street, dulling the edges of the city. Cable cars grind slowly up the incline, their bells clanging with mechanical patience. Commuters pass the tall iron gates without looking up. A delivery truck pauses, unloads crates, then pulls away. To most people walking here today, this corner appears almost ordinary. Behind those gates stands a heavy stone mansion, solid, restrained, its granite facade cool and indifferent to the passing century. The building now belongs to a private club. Its windows reflect the pale sky. Its doors open discreetly for members who speak in lowered voices. Nothing about the place announces the story
to the
buried
Comstock
inside.
Lode,
But in the
where unimaginable
1870s,
wealth in
this
silver
hilltop
ore
was
lay
the most
waiting beneath
extravagant
Virginia
address
City.
in the American West. And the house standing here, then newly completed, blazing with chandeliers and filled with imported marble, was not simply a residence. It was a declaration, a monument to sudden wealth. A fortress built by a man who had clawed his fortune out of the earth hundreds of miles away in the silver veins of Nevada. A man who arrived in San Francisco almost unknown, and within a decade stood among the richest figures on the continent. His name was James Clair Flood, and this mansion was his answer to a question that haunted the entire Gilded Age. What does a man do when he becomes unimaginably rich almost overnight? On Nob Hill, the answer was simple. He built something the world cannot ignore. But the deeper question, the one that still lingers in the stone walls of this house, is harder to dismiss. What happens when that fortune comes from a place most people would rather not look? Because the money that raised these granite walls did not begin in San Francisco. It began underground, in darkness, in heat, in mines where thousands of men labored for wages that barely kept them alive. And when the mansion rose above the city
silver policy
in
is quite frankly
1886,
an outrage.
glittering against the
Indeed,
skyline,
it threatens
carried
the very
that buried
foundation
story
of
with it.
sound money.
The Hill remembers. Long before the mansions arrived, Nob Hill was little more than wind-scoured ground.
San Francisco,
overlooking
strategically
the growing
positioned
port
at
below.
the edge of the
In the
continent,
1850s,
rapidly became
the
the
slopes were dotted
undisputed
with
center
small
of this
wooden
burgeoning
houses
Pacific
and
trade.
rough boarding rooms for sailors and merchants. The city itself was still improvising its identity. Half-frontier settlement, half-booming port, swollen by the gold rush. San Francisco was young then, reckless, hungry. Fortunes appeared quickly and disappeared just as fast. Yet by the 1870s, something new had begun to rise above the harbor fog. A new class of men, railroad magnates, mining barons, financiers, had accumulated wealth on a scale the city had never seen before. They wanted somewhere to display it, and Nob Hill became their stage. From this ridge, the richest men in California could look down upon the city that had made them powerful. Their homes would sit above the smoke and noise, visible from the harbor like a row of crowns. The railroad kings came first, then the bankers, then, slightly apart from them all, came James Clair. He was not born into wealth. Far from it. Flood arrived in California during the gold rush years. One more immigrant chasing rumors of opportunity in a place where rules were still being invented. For years, he drifted through the rough economy of mining camps and frontier towns, working as a saloon keeper and small-time entrepreneur. Nothing about his early life suggested the future that waited for him, until the Comstock Lode. In 1859, prospectors in Nevada uncovered one of the richest silver deposits ever discovered in North America. The mines of Virginia City soon became a frenzy of speculation and ambition. Men invested fortunes chasing veins of ore that might vanish without warning. Flood saw something others missed. He partnered with three fellow investors, William O'Brien, James Fair, and John Mackay. Together, they became known as the Bonanza Kings. Their mine struck a staggering deposit of silver so vast that newspapers struggled to describe it. One San Francisco reporter wrote in 1873 that the Comstock had produced wealth beyond calculation, pouring from the mountains like a river of metal. Flood's share alone would eventually be worth tens of millions of dollars. But the silver did not rise from the earth by itself. Thousands of miners descended daily into the shafts beneath Virginia City. The tunnels were suffocatingly hot, sometimes exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
The
Timber supports
restoration work on
creaked
the main
under
hall
immense
truly
pressure
is
from the
remarkable,
surrounding
isn't it?
rock.
Indeed.
Explosions were common.
They've maintained
Collapses
the
were
original
inevitable.
grandeur.
A miner named John McCarthy later wrote in a letter preserved by the Nevada Historical Society, "We worked where the air burned your lungs and the ground shook with blasting. A man might walk into the shaft in the morning and never see daylight again." Above ground, the silver made millionaires. Below ground, the work continued in darkness. And while that labor unfolded far away in the Nevada desert, the profits traveled west, across the Sierra Nevada, into the banks of San Francisco, and finally, onto this hill. By the early 1880s, Nob Hill had transformed into the most exclusive neighborhood in the West. The mansions of railroad tycoons Leland Stanford and Collis P. Huntington stood nearby, their towers visible from miles away. Yet Flood wanted something different. Not wood, stone. He had watched fire tear through San Francisco before. The city burned easily in those years, its buildings crowded close together, its streets packed with timber structures and coal stoves. Fires moved through neighborhoods like wind. Flood intended his house to survive. So he ordered something almost unheard of for a private residence on the West Coast: granite. Massive blocks were quarried and transported to the hilltop. The structure that rose from the ground looked less like a domestic home and more like a European fortress. Thick walls, arched windows, iron gates guarding the entrance. A San Francisco Chronicle reporter visiting the nearly completed house in 1886 described it with restrained amazement. The Flood residence rises upon Nob Hill like a castle placed above the city, its gray stone walls proclaiming permanence in a town still accustomed to impermanence. Inside, however, permanence gave way to spectacle. Imported chandeliers illuminated polished marble floors. Silk wall coverings arrived from Europe. Massive fireplaces carved from Italian stone anchored rooms large enough to host hundreds of guests. The house was not merely a residence. It was a statement. Flood had come west with nothing. Now he stood above the entire city. But buildings like this are never only about architecture. They're about power, about the desire to transform wealth into something visible, something solid, something that cannot easily be taken away. And yet the landscape surrounding Nob Hill had already seen how quickly fortunes could turn in San Francisco. Fog still rolled across the hill each evening. The wind still moved through the streets. And beneath the granite walls of Flood's mansion, though no one standing in its ballroom could hear it, the distant mines of the Comstock continued to echo with drills and explosions. Silver was still rising from the earth. Men were still descending into the dark. And the house on Nob Hill was waiting to begin the brief, brilliant life it had been built for. The mansion on Nob Hill did not emerge from quiet ambition. It rose from rivalry. By the early 1880s, the hill had become a theater where San Francisco's most powerful men performed their wealth in stone and glass. Their homes were not merely residences. They were declarations of victory in the violent economic contest that had shaped the American West. Each mansion answered the same unspoken question: who truly ruled this city? To stand on Nob Hill during those years was to look upon a skyline of private empires. The towering residence of Leland Stanford loomed nearby, its elaborate towers visible across the bay. Collis P. Huntington's mansion stood not far away, another monument raised by railroad money that had stretched iron rails across a continent. And between them, on the slope overlooking California Street, James C. Flood began raising something different. Not a palace of ornament, a citadel. Flood was a quiet man compared to many of his neighbors. Where others relished public attention, he moved through San Francisco society with a measured reserve that sometimes appeared almost cold. He rarely gave interviews. He rarely sought applause, but he understood the language of architecture. If the railroad barons built towers to celebrate expansion, Flood would build a fortress to declare endurance. Because Flood believed something many others in San Francisco did not. He believed the city would burn again. San Francisco had already suffered several catastrophic fires during its early decades. Entire districts had vanished overnight. Wooden houses, beautiful but fragile, collapsed into flame as wind carried embers across the hills. Flood had watched these disasters carefully. So when construction began on his home in the early 1880s, he made a decision that puzzled many observers. He would build entirely of stone. The granite arrived in massive blocks, quarried and hauled at extraordinary cost. Workers fitted the stones together with the patience of cathedral builders. The walls grew thicker than most urban residences had any reason to be. Visitors who passed the site during construction noticed something unusual. The mansion seemed less concerned with elegance than survival. The San Francisco Evening Bulletin wrote in 1885, "The Flood residence progresses slowly, but with a solidity that suggests it may outlive the rest of Nob Hill itself." Inside those walls, however, Flood intended no austerity. He had not endured the brutal uncertainties of mining finance, merely to live modestly at the height of his fortune. The house would be comfortable, magnificent even, but always controlled, never theatrical. That balance reflected the man himself. James Clair Flood had learned early that fortunes in the West could evaporate without warning. He had watched men grow rich during the gold rush and collapse into bankruptcy months later. Entire towns had risen around a rumor of ore, only to vanish when the veins ran dry. The Comstock Lode had been different. It had produced wealth on a scale that reshaped the entire Pacific Coast economy. Silver from Nevada financed railroads, banks, newspapers, and political careers. San Francisco became the financial center of that new empire of metal. But even the Comstock carried risk. Flood and his partners had survived the chaos of speculation because they were disciplined in ways many rivals were not. They understood that the mine's true value lay not in rumor, but in geology, in the patient extraction of ore from crushing depths. The deeper the shafts descended, the more dangerous the work became. Temperatures underground climbed to levels few miners had experienced before. Ventilation systems struggled to push fresh air through the labyrinth of tunnels. Pumps fought constantly against underground water flooding the shafts. And yet the silver kept coming. In 1873, a journalist from the Territorial Enterprise visited the mines and described the scene with grim admiration. Men toil here where no sunlight has ever reached. Their lamps burn in the black air, while the rock groans above them like a living thing. Each wagon of or hauled to the surface carried wealth that would ripple outward across the American economy. Flood understood exactly what that meant. The mansion he was building on Nob Hill was not only a reward for success, it was proof that success had been real. The architecture reflected that purpose, rather than the elaborate French-inspired designs favored by other Gilded Age magnates. Flood chose a restrained Italian style, massive, symmetrical, almost severe. The granite facade formed a rectangular structure that seemed rooted into the hill itself. Inside, the rooms opened into one another with quiet grandeur. High ceilings allowed light to spill across marble floors. Staircases curved upward beneath chandeliers imported from Europe. Fireplaces carved from polished stone warmed drawing rooms large enough to host the city's most powerful families. But unlike many mansions of the era, Flood's house did not rely on ostentation alone. It relied on permanence. Visitors entering the home often noticed how quiet it felt compared to other residences on Nob Hill. The thick stone walls muffled the noise of the city outside. Carriages passing on the street sounded distant, almost unreal. It was a house designed to shut the world out, and yet the world was precisely what had built it. San Francisco in the 1880s pulsed with energy unlike any other American city west of Chicago. Ships arrived daily from Asia and Europe. Banks financed mining ventures, railroads, and global trade routes stretching across the Pacific. Fortunes were no longer being dug from riverbeds with shovels. They were being engineered. Flood had become one of the architects of that transformation. By the time his mansion neared completion in 1886, he was widely recognized as one of the most powerful financiers in California. His investments extended beyond mining into banking and real estate. He moved quietly through rooms where decisions shaped the entire Western economy. But power of that scale rarely remains uncontested. San Francisco's elite society was filled with men who had grown rich quickly and were determined to prove themselves worthy of their new status. Their mansions became stages for elaborate dinners, political negotiations, and carefully choreographed displays of influence. Flood did not always enjoy those performances, yet the house on Nob Hill ensured he could not avoid them, because once the granite mansion was complete, it stood directly among the city's most visible symbols of wealth. Visitors arriving by ship saw Nob Hill rising above the harbor fog, its cluster of mansions gleaming against the skyline. And among them was Flood's stone fortress. A San Francisco Chronicle columnist observed shortly after the house opened, "One cannot pass Nob Hill without noticing the Flood residence. It has the air of something that expects to remain." For Flood, that expectation was the entire point. The mansion would endure, the fortune behind it would endure, and the name carved into the granite would endure. At least, that was the belief. But cities rarely respect the plans of powerful men. Beneath the glittering surface of San Francisco's Gilded Age, pressures were already building. Economic tensions, social divisions, and geological forces no architect could control. The hill itself remained silent. Fog continued to roll in from the Pacific. Wind moved through the unfinished gardens surrounding the new mansion, and the granite walls stood patiently, waiting to discover whether permanence in San Francisco was ever truly possible. At night, Nob Hill became a constellation. Gas lamps flickered along California Street. Carriages climbed the steep grade with the steady rhythm of hooves against cobblestone. From the harbor below, sailors could look toward the dark hillside and see light pouring from the great mansions above the fog. The city glittered, and among those lights, one building burned steadily behind its granite walls. The Flood Mansion had begun its life. By the late 1880s, the house stood complete, a vast, fireproof residence anchored in Nob Hill like a medieval stronghold overlooking a restless port city. The granite exterior gave little hint of the life unfolding inside. Its walls were heavy, deliberate, almost austere. But once the doors opened, the interior revealed the true ambition of the place. The main staircase curved upward in polished marble, its banister cool beneath the hands of arriving guests. High ceilings allowed chandeliers to scatter light across the floors in shimmering patterns. Velvet curtains softened the tall windows. Imported carpets absorbed the sound of footsteps. The rooms were large enough to host hundreds, and increasingly, they did. San Francisco society had always been eager for spectacle. But in the years after the Comstock fortunes transformed the city's elite, social gatherings became a language of power. Invitations were sought, studied, and sometimes envied. To appear at the right house on the right evening could shape reputations that lasted for decades. The Flood Mansion quickly joined the small circle of places where those reputations were made. Guests arrived in carriages that lined the street outside the iron gates. Footmen opened doors as ladies stepped carefully onto the stone walkways, their gowns brushing against the night air. Gentlemen followed in tailored coats, their conversation already drifting toward business and politics. Inside, the house came alive. Music carried through the rooms. Crystal glasses clinked softly against silver trays. Waiters moved quietly between guests, balancing platters prepared in kitchens large enough to serve a grand hotel. The gatherings were elegant but rarely extravagant. James C. Flood preferred control to excess. His reputation among San Francisco's elite was that of a man who had mastered fortune without allowing fortune to master him. He entertained often, but the tone of his house was restrained, almost disciplined compared to the flamboyant parties held by some of his neighbors. Visitors noticed this difference. The San Francisco Call wrote, after one reception in the early 1890s, "The Flood residence possesses a dignity distinct from the glittering houses nearby. One senses not merely wealth here, but the intention that wealth should appear permanent." That intention shaped every corner of the mansion. The dining room glowed with candlelight reflected in polished silver. Portraits lined the walls, faces watching silently as the city's most powerful figures gathered beneath them. Conversation flowed easily between politics and finance, between railroad expansion and mining investment. Outside the windows, San Francisco stretched toward the bay in a patchwork of lights and shadows. Inside, the city's future was often being decided. Flood himself rarely dominated the room. Witnesses described him as composed, observant, and occasionally distant. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, the room tended to quiet. The fortune behind the mansion had given him influence few men in the city could match. But the house was not only his domain. His daughter, Jenny Flood, soon became one of the most visible figures within its walls. She had grown up alongside her father's rising fortune, watching Nob Hill transform from a quiet ridge into the center of San Francisco's social world. By the time the mansion reached its full life in the 1890s, she had assumed a role familiar to many daughters of America's new industrial elite. She became the host. Jenny Flood understood something essential about San Francisco society. The city was young, still searching for traditions to anchor its sudden wealth. The great houses of Nob Hill attempted to provide that sense of permanence. Dinners were carefully arranged. Guest lists were balanced between bankers, politicians, railroad executives, and visiting dignitaries from the East Coast and Europe. Music was selected to match the mood of the evening. The mansion's rooms, vast yet intimate, allowed conversations to drift naturally between groups, and the view from a hill remained unforgettable. Guests stepping onto the balcony could see the entire city beneath them. The harbor shimmered with lanterns from anchored ships. The bay stretched dark and silent beyond Alcatraz. Wind moved gently through the gardens surrounding the house. One visitor recorded the moment in a letter written in 1892. From the Flood residence, one may observe San Francisco as though it were a living map, each light marking a life below, while the houses of Nob Hill stand like watchtowers above them. The hill itself had become a symbol of the new American West. Railroad money, mining fortunes, and global trade had transformed a once remote port into a city of staggering wealth. The mansions of Nob Hill were proof that San Francisco now believed itself equal to the great capitals of the world. But symbols can conceal as much as they reveal. While the Flood Mansion hosted evenings of polished conversation, the city below remained far less elegant. Dockworkers unloaded cargo through the night along the waterfront. Labor unrest simmered in neighborhoods crowded with immigrants who had arrived chasing the same promises that had enriched men like Flood. The divide between those worlds could be measured in elevation. From Nob Hill, the streets below seemed distant and orderly. From the streets below, the hill looked like another planet. Yet for the moment, the balance held. The mansion continued to glow each evening, its chandeliers visible through tall windows that faced the harbor. Carriages came and went. Musicians played late into the night. The city's most powerful figures gathered within those granite walls to talk about the future they believed they were shaping. And outside, the hill watched. Fog moved slowly across the rooftops. Wind curled around the towers of neighboring mansions. The stone walls of Flood's house remained cool and immovable against the night air. The house had become exactly what James C. Flood intended: a fortress of wealth, a symbol of permanence, a place where San Francisco's new aristocracy could gather and look out across the city that had made them rich. For a time, it seemed impossible that such a place could ever fall. But history has a way of waiting quietly behind moments of triumph. And somewhere far beneath the foundations of this glittering age, beneath the silver mines, beneath the railroads, beneath the granite mansions rising above the fog, forces were already gathering that would soon test the very idea of permanence on Nob Hill. From the outside, Nob Hill looked like a triumph. Four enormous mansions crowned the ridge above San Francisco: the residences of the railroad kings, the mining barons, the financiers who had turned a rough Pacific port into the economic engine of the American West. Their towers rose above the fog. Their windows glowed late into the night. Visitors arriving by ship saw the hill first and understood immediately where power lived. It was a skyline built to impress, but every monument hid the foundation, and the foundations of the Gilded Age were rarely clean. Inside the Flood Mansion, evenings continued with polished grace. The chandeliers shone. Conversations moved easily between art, business, and politics. Guests admired the stone walls that promised safety in a city known for fire. Yet the wealth sustaining those gatherings had been pulled from places that few of those guests ever visited. Hundreds of miles east, the mines of the Comstock Lode continued their relentless work. The deeper the shafts descended, the more brutal the conditions became. Underground temperatures climbed to levels that felt almost unlivable. Engineers pumped cool air into the tunnels, but the heat of the surrounding rock constantly pushed back. Timber supports strained under crushing geological pressure, and always there was water. Groundwater seeped through cracks in the rock, filling the shafts faster than pumps could remove it. Flooding became a constant threat. A broken pipe or failed pump could drown entire sections of the mine within hours. The wealth flowing into San Francisco depended on men who worked in that environment every day. A miner named Patrick Delaney described it in an 1878 letter later archived in Virginia City. "We go down where the air itself feels angry. The rock sweats water, and the heat sits on your chest. A man grows used to the darkness, but never to the sound of the timbers bending." Delaney's words never reached Nob Hill. Or if they did, they were rarely discussed in rooms where silver profits were converted into property and influence. This was the quiet contradiction of the Gilded Age. The mansions were not lies. They were real achievements, architectural marvels financed by genuine fortunes. But the distance between where the wealth was created and where it was displayed allowed a certain kind of silence to flourish. In the drawing rooms of Nob Hill, silver was discussed as finance. In the tunnels of the Comstock, it was survival. James Flood understood that difference better than many of his peers. Unlike some financiers who treated mining as an abstract investment, Flood had spent years closely tied to the operations that created his fortune. He knew the risks. He knew the labor required to wrest metal from rock 2,000 feet below the Nevada desert. But understanding something does not always change how it is used. The Flood mansion rose from that knowledge just as surely as it rose from granite. The hill itself seemed indifferent to these contradictions. Wind continued to sweep across its slopes. Fog rolled in from the Pacific with the same quiet persistence it had shown for centuries before San Francisco existed. And within the house, life continued with a rhythm that felt secure, until time began to move forward. James Flood did not live long enough to enjoy his fortress for many years. In 1889, only 3 years after the mansion had been completed, he died at the age of 63. The official cause was illness, though newspapers of the time wrote about his declining health with careful restraint. The man who had risen from frontier uncertainty to unimaginable wealth was suddenly gone. The granite house remained. Responsibility for the estate passed largely to his daughter, Jenny Flood, who had already been managing much of the social life inside the mansion. She inherited not only the house, but also the expectations attached to it. In San Francisco society, such houses were never simply private property. They were institutions. Jenny maintained the mansion with a sense of duty that observers frequently remarked upon. The receptions continued. The dinners remained carefully organized. The house retained its reputation for quiet dignity amid the more flamboyant displays of Nob Hill. Yet beneath the surface of that stability, the city itself was changing. The late 19th century had been an era of explosive wealth in the American West. But economic booms rarely last forever. Mining profits fluctuated. Railroad monopolies faced increasing public criticism. Labor unrest grew more visible in cities across the country. San Francisco felt those pressures as sharply as anywhere. Newspapers began publishing more critical editorials about the enormous fortunes that dominated the city's economy. Reformers questioned whether such wealth had come at too high a cost for the working population that kept the port running. A columnist in the San Francisco Examiner wrote in 1893, "Above the fog stand the palaces of Nob Hill, monuments to fortunes built from the toil of thousands whose homes lie far below those heights." The line struck many readers with unusual force. For the first time, some citizens began looking at Nob Hill differently, not simply as a symbol of prosperity, but as a reminder of the distance between wealth and labor. The mansions themselves could not respond. They stood silent, their granite and stone absorbing the city's shifting moods. Inside the Flood mansion, the routines of society continued much as they always had. But history was moving toward something larger. San Francisco sat on a restless edge of the earth. The city had been built quickly, often without full understanding of the landscape beneath it. Wooden buildings crowded together along narrow streets. Neighborhoods expanded over unstable ground near the bay. The hills themselves, beautiful and commanding, rested above fault lines that few 19th century engineers fully comprehended. The residents of Nob Hill had worried about fire. Few of them worried about the ground itself. And yet the landscape that had watched San Francisco's rise for decades was quietly preparing to remind the city of a truth no fortune could escape. Stone can be strong. Fortunes can be vast. But beneath every mansion, Beneath every street, beneath every shining symbol of power, the earth remains patient. On the morning of April 18, 1906, San Francisco was still asleep. Fog drifted through the streets below Nob Hill. The harbor lay quiet under a pale sky. In the mansions crowning the ridge, servants were only beginning their routines, lighting stoves, preparing breakfast trays, opening curtains to the gray light of early morning. The Flood mansion stood silent behind its iron gates. Its granite walls had endured 2 decades of wind and fog. Inside, the great rooms waited in their usual stillness. Carpets thick beneath the furniture, chandeliers hanging motionless above polished floors. Then, at 5:12 a.m., the ground moved. At first it was subtle. A low vibration passed through the hill, the kind that might be mistaken for a heavy wagon rolling through the street. But within seconds the vibration became a violent convulsion. The earth tore sideways. Across the entire region, the San Andreas Fault ruptured with unimaginable force. Buildings shook as though struck by an invisible hammer. Chimneys collapsed. Windows shattered. Streets split open beneath the weight of moving ground. On Nob Hill, the mansions trembled. Inside the Flood mansion, the massive granite walls groaned under the strain. Furniture slid across the floors. Chandeliers swung wildly, their crystals clattering like breaking glass. Servants clung to door frames as the house lurched back and forth. But the granite held. While wooden houses across the city splintered under the shock, the Flood mansion remained standing, its thick stone construction absorbing the violence of the earthquake. From the windows of Nob Hill, residents could see the city below collapsing in waves of dust. A survivor named Frederick Hamilton later described the moment in a letter published by the San Francisco Chronicle. The ground heaved like the deck of a ship in a storm. Buildings folded upon themselves while clouds of brick and mortar rose into the air. One could hear the city breaking. The shaking lasted less than a minute, but when it stopped, San Francisco had already been transformed. Entire blocks lay in ruins. Water mains had shattered beneath the streets. Fires ignited almost immediately, small at first, scattered among the debris of collapsed buildings. Then the wind arrived. By mid-morning, flames were spreading through neighborhoods where firefighters had no water to fight them. Broken pipes left hydrants dry. Fire crews resorted to dynamiting buildings in desperate attempts to create fire breaks. The explosions only added to the chaos. From Nob Hill, thick smoke began rising across the city, and the fire was moving uphill. Throughout that day, residents of the hill watched the flames approach from multiple directions. Entire districts vanished behind curtains of black smoke. The sky turned orange. Ash began falling across the streets like snow. The mansions that had symbolized San Francisco's wealth now faced a test none of their builders had imagined. Stanford's grand residence caught fire first. Flames tore through its wooden structure, consuming the elaborate interiors that had once hosted senators and railroad magnates. The Huntington Mansion soon followed, its ornate towers collapsing into burning rubble. One by one, the great houses of Nob Hill fell. The fire was relentless. By the second night, the inferno had reached the base of the hill itself. Flames crept through the streets below, devouring entire rows of buildings. Heat from the advancing firestorm grew so intense that residents fled their homes, carrying whatever possessions they could manage. Many expected the Flood mansion to burn like the others. Yet the house had been built for this moment. Granite does not ignite. As the fire climbed Nob Hill, flames engulfed the gardens and surrounding structures. Heat blasted against the stone walls. Windows shattered under the pressure of expanding air. Smoke filled the rooms where San Francisco's elite had once gathered beneath chandeliers. But the building itself refused to burn. Witnesses standing in nearby streets watched the inferno sweep around the mansion like water around a rock in a river. A reporter from the San Francisco Call described the scene 2 days later. The Flood residence stood alone upon Nob Hill while the fire raged around it, its stone walls blackened by smoke yet unmoved by the flames that destroyed its neighbors. By the time the firestorm finally died, after 3 days of devastation, San Francisco had been nearly erased. More than 28,000 buildings were destroyed. Entire neighborhoods lay in ashes. Hundreds of thousands of residents were suddenly homeless. The once glittering skyline of Nob Hill had been reduced to smoking ruins. Except for one building. When the smoke cleared, the Flood mansion still stood. Its windows were shattered, its interior scarred by heat and smoke. The garden surrounding it had been reduced to charred earth. But the granite fortress remained, where the mansions of the railroad kings had vanished. Flood's house stood alone on the hill. The city below, it had become a wasteland of blackened debris. Streets once filled with carriages and cable cars were now choked with rubble. Survivors wandered through the ruins, searching for anything that had not burned. For many residents, the sight of the mansion felt almost unreal. In a city that had lost nearly everything, one structure from the old Nob Hill still endured. Yet survival can carry its own kind of loneliness. The house had been built as part of a community of wealth and power, a row of mansions proclaiming San Francisco's arrival among the great cities of the world. Now it stood in isolation. The great neighbors were gone. The hill itself had been changed forever, and the granite walls that had survived the disaster were about to witness a different kind of transformation, one that would reshape the purpose of the mansion and the memory of the world that had created it. When the fires finally died, San Francisco looked like a battlefield. The city that had once glittered beside the Pacific now lay flattened beneath a gray sky. Entire districts had vanished. Streets were buried under collapsed brick, twisted iron, and layers of ash that drifted through the air for days after the flames stopped. Nearly half the population was suddenly homeless. Families slept in parks, on beaches, or beneath makeshift tents constructed from blankets and salvage boards. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Food lines formed in the open squares where neighborhoods had once stood. And above it all, Nob Hill remained eerily quiet. Where 4 great mansions had once crowned the ridge, only one building still stood. The Flood Mansion. Its granite walls were streaked with soot. Windows gaped empty where glass had shattered under the heat of the firestorm. The gardens had been reduced to scorched ground where only fragments of iron fencing remained. But the structure itself endured. Visitors climbing the hill in the days after the disaster described the scene with a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. In a landscape of ruin, the mansion appeared almost defiant. A correspondent for the San Francisco Chronicle wrote on April 22, 1906, "The Flood residence stands solitary upon Nob Hill, a survivor among ghosts. Where once stood palaces of wood and ornament, there is now only this granite house and the silence of what has been lost." For Jenny Flood, the survival of the mansion presented a decision. She could rebuild the life that had once existed there, restore the grand rooms, resume the gatherings, attempt to recreate the social world that had flourished before the earthquake. But San Francisco after the fire was not the same city. The population had been scattered. The economy was uncertain. Nob Hill itself had been transformed from a district of opulent residences into a landscape of empty lots and smoldering foundations. Recreating the past would have meant ignoring the reality unfolding around her. Jenny Flood chose another path. Instead of restoring the mansion as a private residence, she donated the building to an educational institution that was itself struggling to survive the disaster. The school was called the Pacific Union Club's successor institution, later becoming the exclusive Pacific Union Club building. But before that transition, the mansion temporarily served the Sisters of the Sacred Heart, whose school had been destroyed in the earthquake. For a time, the granite fortress that had once hosted the wealthiest figures in the American West became something very different. A school. Classrooms replaced drawing rooms. Desks appeared where society guests had once gathered beneath chandeliers. Young students walked through hallways that had previously echoed with the conversations of bankers and mining magnates. The transformation was quiet but profound. In letters preserved by the religious of the Sacred Heart archives, one teacher described the experience in 1907. "The building is enormous, and the children wander its corridors with wonder. It is strange to think that such grandeur was once only a private house." Outside, San Francisco was rebuilding itself with astonishing speed. Carpenters hammered new structures into place across the ruins. Temporary wooden buildings appeared first. Shops, offices, boarding houses, constructed quickly to restore the city's economic life. Railroads resumed operation. Ships returned to the harbor. Within a few years, much of downtown San Francisco had been reborn. But Nob Hill never fully returned to what it had been before. The railroad barons chose not to rebuild their great mansions. The cost was enormous, and the social geography of the city was shifting. Wealthy families began moving to newer neighborhoods, farther from the commercial center that was expanding rapidly after the fire. The hill that had once symbolized Gilded Age power gradually changed character. Hotels rose where private palaces had once stood. The Mark Hopkins Hotel eventually replaced the site of one of the grandest mansions destroyed in the fire. Apartment buildings appeared along the slopes. Nob Hill remained prestigious, but it was no longer a private kingdom of industrial titans. And through all of it, the Flood Mansion remained. Its granite walls required little repair compared to the devastation around it. The fire had scarred the building, but the structure itself remained as solid as the day it was completed. In time, the mansion passed into the hands of the Pacific Union Club, an elite private organization founded by some of San Francisco's most powerful citizens. The club restored the building carefully, but they did not erase its past. The great rooms remained much as they had been during the flood era. High ceilings, heavy fireplaces, and tall windows overlooking the city. New generations of businessmen, financiers, and civic leaders gathered inside those same walls, discussing the future of a city that had been forced to reinvent itself. Yet something had changed. The mansion was no longer a symbol of sudden wealth. It had become something quieter, a survivor. The hill itself seemed to acknowledge that transformation. The fog still rolled across the ridge each evening, softening the outlines of the buildings. Wind moved through the streets, just as it had when Nob Hill was little more than open ground overlooking the bay. But the skyline had altered. The row of glittering mansions was gone. Only the granite house remained to remember them. And within those walls, beneath chandeliers that had once illuminated the Gilded Age, the city continued to gather, carrying forward the memory of a world that had been built quickly, displayed proudly, and destroyed almost overnight. On Nob Hill today, the fog still arrives first. It slips quietly through the streets in the early morning, softening the outlines of buildings and turning the hill into a place that feels suspended between centuries. Cable cars climb the slope with the same stubborn rhythm they have followed for more than 100 years. Tourists pause near the corner of California and Mason, lifting their cameras toward the skyline. Most of them are looking at the hotels. The Mark Hopkins Hotel rises nearby, its tower visible across the city. The Fairmont stands just beyond it, a monument to San Francisco's ability to rebuild after catastrophe. These structures dominate the hill now, symbols of the city that emerged after the fires of 1906. But just a short distance away, behind iron gates and a quiet stretch of stone wall, the past is still standing. The Flood Mansion. It does not advertise itself. The building sits slightly apart from the flow of visitors, its granite facade unchanged by the passing decades. The stone blocks remain cool and gray, just as they were when laborers lifted them into place during the 1880s. The windows reflect the modern skyline, but the structure itself belongs to another age. Inside, the rooms are still there. The grand staircase still curves upward beneath high ceilings. Fireplaces carved from Italian marble remain set into the walls. Heavy wooden doors open into spaces where voices have carried across nearly a century and a half. But the voices have changed. Today the mansion serves as the home of the Pacific Union Club, one of the most private and exclusive institutions in San Francisco. Business leaders, financiers, and influential figures still gather within those walls, just as powerful men once gathered there when the house was new. History does not disappear. Sometimes it simply changes its audience. If you stand across the street and look carefully, it is possible to imagine the earlier world that once existed on this hill. For enormous mansions, lanterns glowing through tall windows, carriages lining the street outside iron gates, a skyline of private empires. All of it vanished within 3 days. The earthquake and fire of 1906 erased nearly every physical symbol of San Francisco's Gilded Age. The houses of Stanford, Huntington, and Crocker disappeared into smoke and rubble. Their owners had believed those buildings would last for generations. Instead, they lasted barely a few decades. Only the Flood Mansion endured. Not because it was the most beautiful, not because it was the most celebrated, But because its owner had chosen stone, a decision made out of fear of fire became the reason the building survived one of the most destructive urban disasters in American history. And yet survival can produce its own kind of irony. The mansion that was built as a monument to personal wealth ultimately became something more communal. A school, a club, a gathering place for people who never knew James Flood and never saw the world that created his fortune. The building outlived its purpose. The hill itself seems to understand this better than anyone who walks across it today. Long before Nob Hill held mansions, the wind moved freely across open ground overlooking the bay. Long before silver mines financed palaces of granite, the land simply watched ships enter and leave the harbor below. Cities rise quickly here. They always have. The gold rush turned a quiet shoreline into a roaring boomtown almost overnight. The Comstock Lode poured wealth into San Francisco that reshaped the entire West. Railroad empires stretched across the continent. Bankers and financiers built houses that rivaled the palaces of Europe. And yet the earth beneath the city remained unchanged. In 1906, it reminded everyone of that fact. The mansions of Nob Hill were not destroyed because their owners lacked ambition. They were destroyed because ambition alone cannot control the forces that shape history. The Flood mansion survived almost by accident. A practical decision. Thick walls. Granite hauled at enormous cost because one man believed the city would burn again. He was right. But even that foresight did not preserve the world he had built the mansion to celebrate. The society that once gathered beneath its chandeliers disappeared along with the neighboring houses. What remains is the structure itself. Stone, quiet, watching the city continue to change around it. Every evening, fog rolls in from the Pacific and drifts across Nob Hill, just as it did when the first wooden houses were built here. The wind moves through the streets. Lights appear in windows across the skyline. The city lives on, but the Flood mansion stands as a quiet reminder of something deeper about San Francisco's history, something that echoes far beyond this hill. Fortunes can rise in a single generation. Cities can reinvent themselves in a matter of years. And the monuments we build to prove our permanence can disappear almost overnight. Except sometimes for one building, one survivor, one silent witness. And when you stand on Nob Hill today, looking at that granite house that refused to burn while an entire city turned to ash, the question that remains is not simply how it survived. The real question is this: when the next great transformation comes, and history suggests it always does, what from our own time will still be standing here to tell the story of who we thought we were?